In the shadowed halls of a forgotten fortress, a boy once screamed, but no one heard him. He wasn't murdered by enemies. He wasn't lost in war. His fate was far worse. He was sealed alive, brick by brick, inside a wall, by his own father. This is not folklore. This is a real story buried in the dark corners of Balkan history, and tonight we're going to open that wall. This is the haunting tale of the prince who vanished, and the king who made him disappear. Let's dive into our dark content in the highlands of the Balkans, where mist curls through pine-covered hills and the ruins of ancient fortresses cling to the edges of stone cliffs. Stories echo longer than memory. Some of these stories are legends, others are half-remembered truths, and some sit buried beneath stone, literally haunting the very walls that were meant to hold them. This is the story of one such wall, and one forgotten boy who, if the story is true, was never meant to be remembered at all. His name has been lost to history. Perhaps it was Alexander, like his grandfather, or perhaps it was Michael, as later folklore suggests. Maybe he had no name that survived past the breath in his throat. What we do know is that he was a prince, a son of a czar, and more disturbingly, that he was sentenced to death not by enemy swords or a rebellious uprising, but by the deliberate, cold decision of his own father. Sealed alive. Entombed not in the earth, but inside a stone wall, an unmarked grave built into the very palace where he was born. To understand how something so unthinkable could have happened, we must go back, not just to a single moment of cruelty, but to a crumbling world. This was the 14th century, in the final decades of the medieval Bulgarian Empire. At its peak, the empire had stretched across the Balkans, a proud Orthodox Christian state that rivaled Byzantium. Its cathedrals gleamed with gold. Its cities thrived. But that age of glory had passed. By the late 1300s, the empire was fractured, divided by internal strife and weakened by decades of conflict. And at the gates of Europe, something even more terrifying had begun: the Ottoman advance. The Ottomans were not just another rival. They were an unstoppable wave, a new power sweeping across Anatolia and into southeastern Europe. They came not just with armies, but with a system, a discipline, a strategy, and a hunger that knew no borders. Kingdoms fell before them. Nobles bent the knee or vanished, and standing in their path, clinging to what was left of his throne, was Tsar Ivan Shishman of Bulgaria. Ivan Shishman became Tsar in 1371. But he did not inherit a united kingdom. His father, Ivan Alexander, in an effort to preserve peace among his sons, had divided the empire before his death. One part went to Ivan Shishman, ruling from Tarnovo, the traditional capital. Another part went to his half-brother, Ivan Sratsimir, who ruled from Vidin in the northwest. The two brothers both claimed the imperial title. Neither recognized the other's sovereignty. The result was predictable: a divided, weakened state at the worst possible moment in its history. Ivan Shishman ruled from the fortress city of Tarnovo, perched on high cliffs and encircled by the winding Yantra River. Tsarevets, the royal citadel, stood at the city's heart, a maze of towers, churches, and palace halls. It was here that the final desperate acts of the empire played out. And it was here, in the shadows of collapsing authority and rising fear, that the prince was born. His childhood would have been a strange mix of privilege and dread. Within the stone walls of the palace, he would have been attended by monks and guards, taught to read sacred texts, trained in swordplay, instructed in the affairs of state. But outside those walls, the world was changing rapidly. The Ottomans were drawing closer. Tarnovo was not just a capital anymore. It was a final outpost, a line in the sand. And inside its walls, paranoia began to grow. Ivan Shishman was not a cruel ruler by most historical accounts, but he was a desperate one. He was isolated, politically and geographically. cut off from his half-brother's territory, surrounded by vassals who plotted and traded allegiances. Betrayal was not an if, but a when. And in such an atmosphere, trust was a luxury, even trust in one's own family. What triggered the Tsar's unthinkable decision remains unknown. There are no official records of the prince's death, no royal edict, no execution log. What survives are whispers, folklore passed down through monastic scribes, oral tradition, and stories told in hushed voices in mountain villages. One such account, buried deep in the archives of Rila Monastery, speaks of a royal youth who was accused of treason, or perhaps merely suspected of it. His father, fearing conspiracy, ordered that he be imprisoned in a way that left no trace. No trial, no scandal, no martyr, he was sealed in a wall. It sounds impossible, fantastical, a punishment out of dark fantasy. But in the medieval Balkans, walling was not unheard of. In fact, in a twisted, ritualized way, it was sometimes seen as symbolic, a grim offering for protection. Across the region, tales were told of people, often workers or women, being buried alive in foundations of bridges or fortresses, their bodies meant to ensure the structure would never fall. These weren't legal executions. They were superstitions made real by desperate hands. But this was no mythic bridge. This was a prince, a child born into power and privilege, now sentenced to vanish into stone. The account says he was taken in silence, led not to a courtroom, but to a chamber deep within the fortress, perhaps in one of the towers, perhaps a storage vault, or a passageway that led nowhere. Wherever it was, the space was hollow enough to hold a boy upright and narrow enough to close quickly. Masons were summoned. They were told only what they needed to know. The walls must be reinforced, they were told. Seal this space. Mortar. Brick. Do it tonight. Do it now. Did the boy struggle? Did he plead with his father? Did he understand what was happening? We will never know. His name was erased, his voice never recorded. But his story would live on, not in royal chronicles, but in ghost stories. For centuries after the fall of Tarnovo in 1393, travelers spoke of strange echoes in the fortress, of cold winds that blew through walls that should not let air pass, of sections of the tower where moss grew unnaturally fast. In 1906, during a restoration of the Tsarovets fortress, a team of workers reportedly uncovered a vertical cavity in one of the tower walls. Inside, they found bones, human bones, upright, folded arms. The skeletal remnants of cloth still clung to the body. The workers were said to have stopped immediately. No official report was published. Some say the bones were reburied without ceremony. Others say they vanished. Was this the prince? Or just another lost soul from a city that had seen centuries of war, siege, and ruin? We cannot know. But the story would not die. Because the idea is more powerful than the fact. A boy, punished not for what he did, but for what he might one day become. A king's son, erased to preserve a crumbling throne. The politics of the time help us understand the desperation behind the act. Ivan Shishman knew his rule was ending. After years of resisting the Ottomans, he had finally become their vassal. He paid tribute. He sent troops. He even gave his sister to the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid the Farn in marriage. But nothing stopped the tide. One by one, his cities fell. His allies betrayed him. In 1395, he was finally captured and executed by the Ottomans. Some Bulgarian sources call him a martyr, a saint king who died defending the faith. But others see his reign as a series of tragic compromises, a ruler too proud to submit, but too weak to win. In this context, the story of the sealed prince becomes even darker. Did Ivan Shishman order his son's death to prevent him from becoming a puppet? To stop the Ottomans from using the boy as a future ruler? Or did he suspect the prince of collusion? Was the boy caught speaking with nobles who had already sworn allegiance to the Sultan? Or was it simpler? A dream of rebellion, a prophecy, a rumor? In medieval courts, paranoia could blossom from the faintest whisper. What is especially tragic is that the prince had no advocates. No queen is mentioned, no loyal minister recorded trying to intervene. He simply vanishes, and that absence becomes its own form of presence. In medieval literature, the fate of being buried alive was reserved for traitors, heretics, and the unclean. But it was also used metaphorically as a fate worse than death, a living erasure. In modern terms, the prince was not just executed, he was silenced, and yet, not completely, for even silence has an echo. And over time, that echo grew into a story. The story appears in different versions. In some, the prince was young, barely more than a child. In others, he was a young man, old enough to understand his fate. In some versions, he wept. In others, he accepted his fate with eerie calm, blessing the masons as they began their work. In a few versions, he was even said to have cursed the walls themselves, promising that Tarnovo would fall and that no stone laid in cruelty would stand. What we do know is that Tarnovo did fall. The city was taken in 1393 after a fierce siege. The Ottomans entered the capital, the churches were looted, the libraries burned, and the Tsar, father of the sealed prince, was executed just 2 years later. His bloodline ended, his legacy fractured, but the wall remained. Even today, visitors to the fortress of Zarovets speak of an oppressive stillness in certain corridors. Local guides point to parts of the stonework that seem slightly newer, slightly off color, as if something once hidden was patched over. Some laugh, others pause, and some refuse to go near. Legends, of course, are not evidence, and yet history often leaves its most powerful truths between the lines. The absence of the prince from all royal records is, in itself, suspicious. No burial, no monument, no name. In a royal dynasty that chronicled its lineage obsessively, this disappearance is deafening, and so the story remains. A quiet horror, embedded in Bulgaria's national memory. It is not taught in textbooks, but it is told and retold. Because even when stone silences the voice, memory finds a way. In the end, we are left with questions that have no answers. Who was the prince? Did he truly betray his father? Or was he merely a victim of fear? Was his death an act of justice or of desperation? Was the wall that killed him also the wall meant to protect the kingdom? And if so, what does that say about power? It tells us that kings fear not just the enemy at the gates, but the blood in their own halls. That paranoia, once rooted, grows like ivy, twisting around logic, choking out reason. That even love, even fatherhood, is not immune to the hunger for survival. It tells us that cruelty, once committed, often leaves no mark on the world, except the stories told by those who can never forget. And so, as the wind blows across the ruins of Tarnovo, and the last light fades across the battlements, we remember a prince without a name, a boy who became part of the wall, not buried, not burned, but sealed, alive, and never seen again.